food. Thank you for joining us today for lunch and for a discussion of money, politics, and the U.S. Constitution. My name is Carol McNamara, and I'm the Senior Director of the Center for Constitutional Design here at ASU Law. The Center was established in 2021 to host conversations about constitutional interpretation, reform, and perpetuating American constitutional liberal democracy. We are also interested in the comparative study of constitutionalism. Today, we're hosting a conversation about money and politics and whether we need a constitutional amendment to change the way we regulate money in our campaigns and elections. For the past 50 years, the Supreme Court has been the nation's final arbiter of how we regulate money and politics. Through its campaign finance decisions, the court has taken many options off the table from state and federal policymakers. The question we're going to discuss today is whether these decisions should be the final word on how we spend money in politics. Should there be an amendment to the Constitution that would empower Congress and the states to choose whether and how to regulate money in politics? Today, with our speakers, we'll explore the text and theory of the proposed amendment and the arguments around it. Unfortunately, today, Scott Dave Freeman reported to us this morning that he was unwell and would not be able to participate, but fortunately, we have two speakers here who can sort through the issues for us. First of all, Brian Boyle, who is the one who brought us this topic and proposed the event. Brian Boyle is the Executive Director and General Counsel at American Promise, a nationwide nonprofit organization that is leading a movement for constitutional reform to reduce the influence of money in politics. Before joining the leadership team at American Promise, Brian was a small business owner, a litigator in a national law firm, and a clerk on the Massachusetts Appeals Court. He's been involved in local government, and Brian earned his BA from Harvard and his JD from Cornell Law School. So minor credentials. Corey Langhofer is the managing attorney at Statecraft PLLC. Mr. Langhofer is a law firm focusing on government and political law. His practice is concentrated in campaign finance, constitutional litigation, and political matters. He has previously worked as a federal prosecutor, a litigation counsel to multiple presidential campaigns, and as general counsel for the 2016-2017 presidential transitional team. Corey received his AB in political science, summa cum laude, from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he received his JD from Yale Law School, where he served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. The speakers will take turns. Brian will speak first, and then we'll have a response, and then they will respond to each other, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you. Hey, everybody. First of all, thanks so much for being here. I absolutely love being in law schools and speaking with law students because I find that most of you all are not yet jaded and you still have a lot of optimism about what's possible in our country. And I also wanted to thank Carol McNamara and the Center for Constitutional Design for sponsoring this event. So today I'm just going to start off with some brief remarks, and really what I want to do is to tackle four things before we get into a conversation. The first is just to remind us what is the question that we're considering today. The second is to share with you what the Supreme Court's answer to that question has been for the past 5 decades. The third thing then I'd like to do is just to kind of take a few steps back to some fundamental principles that I really think we should be considering as we think about the question from a constitutional design perspective. And then lastly, I'll just wrap up with what I think the American people's answer to this question can be, and hopefully I will persuade you that a constitutional amendment is part of that. So I hope that sounds like a good agenda for you all, and we can get started. Sorry. Can somebody help me with this? Because it seems like the clicker's not working right now. Yeah, I've been trying to use the back and forth button. Sorry. Let me close it out and then. There we go. All right. All right, so the question, who gets to decide whether and how we're going to regulate money in our campaigns and elections? So pretend you know nothing about this, right? Pretend you don't know the names of any of the cases like Citizens United or Buckley versus Vallejo, and you're just asking who should get to decide. Well, usually when you have a question like that, you look to the Constitution to see if it says anything about who should decide. And when you're reading through, one of the obvious things you'll come across is Article 1, Section 4, which says the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, yada, yada, yada. So you might read that and think, okay, it sounds like states probably have a lot of discretion about how they structure their electoral processes, and Congress generally is going to follow those processes, but it can step in to change the rules when it comes to the election of our federal representatives and senators. But in 1976, when the Supreme Court was asked to consider the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation signed into law by the president, it came to a different answer. So the court acknowledged that there's no question that Congress does have power to regulate in this area, but then they added another consideration, which is whether the regulations may in some way be affected by the First Amendment. The First Amendment, as I'm sure you all probably have memorized by now, talks about abridging, quote, the freedom of speech. And I just want to pause on that for a second because, and we'll talk a little bit about methodology, but if you're just looking at the text of the First Amendment and you see the phrase, the freedom of speech, on its face, it doesn't necessarily say anything about expenditures of money. So the court had to make an inference to connect campaign finance with the First Amendment. So what did they do? Basically, they say that when you restrict the amount that folks can spend in a political campaign, they say it necessarily reduces the quantity of expression. But I just want to point out, they have a little, sort of a quaint view of how this is going to work back in 1976. If you restrict money, you restrict the number of issues discussed, the depth of their exploration, and the size of the audience reached. Now, setting aside the reach point, I think we would be hard-pressed to say that the more money we have, the more issues we're discussing and the more in-depth we're discussing them. In fact, I think what we've seen over the past 50 years is that the more money has actually polarized things, so we're really talking only about a few national issues, and there's often a lot of mudslinging rather than in-depth exploration. So the court in Buckley basically struck down a number of regulations. The thing to keep in mind is they said that you can restrict contributions directly to a candidate, but you cannot restrict how much a candidate or their campaign spends, and you can't restrict how much people may spend on their own without coordinating with a candidate. But even back then, there was Justice White in dissent who was making the point that's relevant for today, which is this is a court acting to strike down provisions that were passed by a majority of Congress and by the president. And so what he's suggesting is that maybe there should be some level of deference to the people who are in the political process and understand how campaign finance actually works on the ground. But at the end of the day, Buckley set the parameters that have governed for the next 50 years. So Buckley said spending money in elections is protected by the First Amendment. It applied exacting scrutiny. And since most of you here are law students, I'm not going to try to go too much into the different levels of scrutiny because I assume you're all familiar with them. But they ask whether the regulation is closely drawn to advance a sufficiently important interest. I do want to just pause here because when we get to the language of the amendment that we're going to be talking about, we have sort of an innovation when it comes to what those interests can be. Buckley rejected political equality and fairness as the type of interest that could justify regulating money, and it only recognized corruption, what it called quid pro quo or the appearance of quid pro quo corruption, as the single sufficiently important interest to justify regulation. And it allowed for limits on contributions, but not expenditures. So I'm not going to go into every single one of these cases. I'll just scroll through. You'll probably see names you recognize. The point that I want to make is that over the next 50 years, there have always been justices in dissent making the point that, as Justice Rehnquist says here, the court is disregarding the judgment of a broad consensus of governmental bodies. So the court's decisions have overruled decisions by state legislatures, state constitutions, and state Supreme Courts. The court has overrode decisions by Congress, bipartisan acts of Congress signed by the president. Justice Stevens here is making a point that over time, right, there should be some level of deference to the legislative judgment, especially when you're looking at a provision, right? The justices have been construing the First Amendment, which on its face textually only bears sort of a slight relation to the actual regulation of money. Justice Souter, this is Davis versus FEC. I just wanted to highlight this because to me this is sort of marks a turning point in how deregulatory the court got with money in politics, because this particular case, the burden on the party being regulated actually had nothing to do with limiting how much they could spend. It was a provision that said if you spend over $350,000 on your own campaign, then your publicly financed opponent can get higher contributions. And so you would have thought, oh, that sounds like under the court's theory, that's all more speech. But the court said, oh no, that additional expenditure from the opponent is going to burden the exercise of the self-finance candidate, so they struck that down. Citizens United, everybody's familiar basically with that, but I just wanted to point out that in addition to the formal holdings, the court made some factual claims. First, they claimed, as a matter of fact, that ingratiation and access are not forms of corruption. And they said that the appearance or influence of access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in our democracy. And I'll share some polling in a little bit that sort of counters that as a factual matter. This is a case folks in Arizona, I'm sure, are familiar with. And again, Justice Kagan is making the point that we should allow the political branches to exercise some level of judgment about what is and what isn't going to strengthen the relationship between constituents and their representatives. And if regulating money in the system is a way of doing that, we should give some deference. You know, I'm generally not somebody that looks internationally for guidance, but just to give some perspective, when the Supreme Court says in McCutcheon that it's simply unacceptable to do anything to try to level the playing field in our campaign finance system, by contrast, in Europe, they acknowledge that reasonable limitations can be necessary to ensure that the voices of all people aren't being drowned out by those with the most money. And then before we get to some fundamental principles, I just wanted to highlight this. Judd Campbell is a conservative legal scholar and originalist who's done some excellent work on the First Amendment. And he went back and he makes the point that even assuming that giving money to a campaign is expressive or somehow implicated by the First Amendment, this is exactly the type of activity that would have been completely fair game for regulation under the founders' original understanding of the First Amendment. Because the First Amendment that the modern Supreme Court has been construing is simply different. It's a 20th century gloss on what the First Amendment means. It is not the original understanding of the First Amendment. All right. So before we get to the language of the amendment, I just wanted to get into some fundamentals. So at its heart, what our movement is doing is kind of hearkening back to some of the most fundamental principles at the American founding. And the key idea was that America was going to be governed by a popular sovereign where all legitimate power flowed from the people. And the way to implement popular sovereignty was through the scheme of representation. But in order for that scheme to work, you need to have a healthy relationship between the constituents and the representative. There's all sorts of interesting questions also about the fact that we're organized largely by places in America. We have districts, we have localities, we have states. So when you think about, okay, constituents includes a broad set of people. There's residents, businesses, civic associations, local leaders, and if you look at the data, some small group of constituents also happen to be campaign donors, although the vast majority of Americans are not donors to political campaigns. Then on the other side, you have all of these non-constituent donors, and you also have non-constituents who are making independent expenditures in elections. So just for example, in the state of Maine a couple years ago when Susan Collins was running for re-election, they had over $200 million flooding into that state for that Senate election. And the vast majority of it was from places outside of Maine. And that's why you had people like the head of the Sportsman Alliance, conservative Republican, Second Amendment champion, who was also in favor of an amendment to reform the system because he said the voices of Mainers were being completely drowned out by outside voices. But unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that right now because the court has basically said that as a matter of First Amendment principle, all of this influence and this ingratiation and access that donors get in the system, it is not corruption as a legal matter. The only thing that is corruption is quid pro quo corruption. The American promise of representative self-government, I think, has a very different conception of what is or is not potentially corrupting. So even apart from a quid pro quo exchange, there are things that are going to affect whether a representative is aligned with their constituents' interests, whether they are responsive to their opinions, and whether they can even hear what their constituents are caring about. So I'll wrap up. We've got, what can the American people's answer to the question be? And actually, before I get into the text of the amendment, I just wanted to share some stats with you, because I think you might find it surprising. So our organization polls on a quarterly basis nationally because we like to track public opinion on this. And I'm just going to read you the 3 questions that we asked in a recent poll. So the first question is, do you agree or disagree that the influence of money in politics is a threat to our democracy? Overall, 89.5% agreed. And when you drill down to the crosstabs, 86.4% of Republicans, 90.6% of Democrats, 92.4% of independents, and 89.6% of other or unaffiliated agree that the influence of money in politics is a threat to our democracy. And it goes back to that relationship. Like, people know, it's common sense that when you have all of this money that's pouring in and affecting who gets to run and what issues are discussed, it undermines the relationship between constituents and representatives. We asked a specific question about a holding of the Supreme Court. Do you agree or disagree that individuals and entities should be able to spend unlimited amounts of money to influence our campaigns and elections, which is the state of the law in the US when it comes to independent expenditures? So only 74.4% disagreed, and again, 72.7% of Republicans, 73.1% of Democrats, 79.6% of independents, and 77% of other and unaffiliated. And then lastly, we asked about a proposed constitutional amendment that would allow Congress and the states to reasonably regulate and limit money in our campaigns and elections. Would you support or oppose this amendment? 76.6% said they would support. That was 73.4% Republicans in support, 78.1% of independents, 78.3% of Democrats, and then other 81.5%. So the reason I wanted to bring those percentages up is because in an era when we're all told that America is so hyperpolarized and we can't agree on anything and we're, hopelessly divided, I can tell you from the polling and I can tell you from being on the ground in states across this country, it does not matter at the grassroots level what your political party is. You're with us on this issue because everyday Americans know that the money in the system is not giving them sufficient voice in their own self-government. So we have what we've been championing. We call it the For Our Freedom Amendment. There have been versions of an amendment to address this problem introduced in Congress since the 80s. I'm going to focus on this particular language because it is the language right now that has the most bipartisan support, especially at the state level. We actually had some Republican conservative state lawmakers submit testimony in Congress in May explaining the basis of their support. And I'll run through this pretty quickly because I know we all want to hear from Corey too. But just to give you a sense of what we're doing here. Section 1 is sort of the normative core of the amendment. It's basically about doubling down on the original idea of popular sovereignty. It starts with we the people because it embraces this idea that every generation has a responsibility to reclaim popular sovereignty. It talks about compelling sovereign interests, not compelling governmental interests, because these are interests that belong to the people. They don't belong to a state government or the federal government, they belong to the American people. And those sovereign interests are the freedom of speech, representative self-government, federalism, the integrity of the political process, and the political equality of natural persons. Basically, Section 1 sets out the types of interests that policymakers should be able to balance when they're crafting campaign finance regulation. Section 2 is sort of the operative language that essentially dejudicializes campaign finance. So it says, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to forbid Congress or the states within their respective jurisdictions from reasonably regulating and limiting contributions and spending in campaigns, elections, or ballot measures. And so basically this is giving the message to the judiciary, stand down for the most part when it comes to campaign finance, let the policymakers make policy. And I just want to make a point as a matter of constitutional structure. Think about the consequence of a bad campaign finance policy created by the Supreme Court now, is that you can't change it unless you amend the Constitution. Because once the court says this is a rule of constitutional law, we're stuck with it. Now, I'm not saying that if this amendment comes into place, some states won't pass dumb campaign finance laws. They might. Congress might do it. But guess what? The fix is simply a new law passed by a majority of the relevant legislature. The fix won't have to be another constitutional amendment. And then lastly, Section 3 is about empowering Congress and the states to implement the other language above. And I just wanted to note, it includes but does not require the power for the relevant legislature to distinguish between natural persons and artificial entities when they're creating rules. So last point I'll make before I turn things over to Corey is that in comparison to some other versions of similar amendments, there's nothing in our language that actually creates specific campaign finance policy. It's all about empowering the legislature, Congress, and the states to create policy. We don't think it makes sense to create campaign finance policy in the Constitution. So this is just about giving the relevant branches of government the authority to experiment, to test what works, to evolve over time as new threats emerge, including but not limited to artificial intelligence, which the FEC is already having to deal with deepfakes and things like that. So it says, listen, courts should largely be out of the business of policing this too much and let the political branches and the people try to figure out what works for them and to change it in response to experience over time. So that is the end of my initial remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have because there's a lot we didn't cover, even about like, well, how do you get this done? So happy to answer questions about that, but thanks so much for your time and attention.
Good afternoon, everyone. Brian, I was really interested in what you had to say, and so much of what you had to say is different from what I expected. I thought you'd have a much more sort of like traditionally progressive take on this proposal, and I don't find it to be traditionally progressive at all. I think significant parts of what he's talking about are textualist. Where he's talking about restraint, like the judiciary not getting in the legislature's lane, letting the legislature drive policy. So I think it's a much more nuanced approach than I'd expected to hear. I still think it's a bad idea. And I want to talk about that. I guess there's probably 5 things I'd say to lay out my overall view on campaign finance and then rebut a couple of the points that he was making. The first is that you should really make it a goal in life to be intellectually consistent. And you are accustomed to having this debate about whether you federalize policy or devolve it to the states in other areas, specifically in abortion and gay marriage. This is a conversation we've been having, like pretty acutely for 15 years or so. You've had these conversations in class. And I'll submit to you that if you think of yourself as Republican or conservative, you probably are in favor of traditionally sending that idea to the states. If you think of yourself as liberal or democratic, you think those policies should be federalized. And what he's proposing goes against, the Republican response to this would usually be like, no, keep it at the federal level, we need to protect our constitutional rights. And then Democratic or progressive groups would generally like to devolve this issue to the states. I suggest to you that you should not let your political lens inform or determine your answer to this sort of question. Like, you should become intellectually consistent on this. And it is possible to be conservative, I think, and oppose assigning this issue to the states, but keeping the idea that abortion and gay marriage should be decided by the states. Of course, almost all these issues are already decided by the Supreme Court, so it's a very theoretical conversation, right? Take it in that context. And the principal distinction may be that there's more of a textual hook for federalizing campaign finance and speech than there is for federalizing gay marriage and abortion, right? So that's a principled reason to say, even though I ordinarily like the states doing it, I don't like it in this context, it's principled. But whatever you do, make sure you've thought it through and you don't have just a political sort of like instinct about what we should be doing in these sorts of circumstances. Strive to be intellectually consistent. The second thought is perhaps a little bit of heresy. And I'm going to say something that I will probably persuade none of you on, but I hope you think about it. If you were asked, what's more important, free speech or property rights? If you grew up in America, if you took civics class in third grade like all the rest of us did, you would say like free speech, like this is a core of what it means to be American. And I'll submit to you, that's not actually true. And you can look at that in the behavior of others. So the amount of money that was spent on federal elections in the last presidential cycle, most expensive election cycle in history. There was a point at which we couldn't measure these things, but I think it's fair to say they were cheaper then. It was about $14.4 billion. That is, let me check this to make sure I get it right, 1/6 of what America spent over that 4-year cycle on candy. It is 1/40th of what America spent in that cycle on soda, like drinking soda. Like, if you look at what people actually spend their money on, which I think is a very good indicator of what people actually value, campaign finance is not that important to them. I think generally that's a good thing because it suggests like the political problems, we all see them, are not so severe that you want to spend your money on it, someone else to take care of that problem. But like, just in objective terms, you would make a greater influence on America by coming up with like, the next Crystal Pepsi, as opposed to reforming campaign finance. So I said you can see that it's not that important an issue by looking at the behavior of others. That's the sort of quantitative method. But I'll put it to you that if you, subjectively, you probably also don't value free speech as much as property rights. Because if you were given the choice between criticizing the dean or giving your professors or this event a negative review or keeping your laptop, you would definitely keep your laptop, right? Or if you had to give up the right to picket the White House in order to keep your house, you would keep your house or your car, whatever it is. Subjectively, you also value property rights more than speech. That's counterintuitive, but I just want to sort of think about where do you spend your energy on reform? Should it be on this or should it be on property rights? I think property rights are objectively and subjectively more important. Not to say this isn't important. The third point I'd make is that we have a widely shared intuition that there is something wrong in American politics. I think people on both sides see that. I have theories about that. I don't want to take you down my own rabbit hole too far. But when you talk about poll numbers where you say, is money a problem in politics, people are answering a different question. They're asking, is politics not working? And they think, yeah, like it's not working, and you're asking about money, so I'm going to say it's money. But it's really not what's causing the problem here. Like, when you think about the figures who are most likely to be criticized by the public, Donald Trump, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, those sorts of figures on the right, Or on the left, like Bernie Sanders, he's a communist, we say, or AOC in New York. These are not the products. Their success has almost nothing to do with large dollars. Like, you do not find billionaires who are like, I'm making, AOC or Marjorie Taylor Greene famous and successful. I'm going to make them win their elections. They win on small dollar donations. Like, their engines, like Bernie Sanders has this amazing ability to get people to give him $15. And so does Donald Trump. Like, honestly, just amazing. And so, one of the options that will never be on the table in any reform, in any state, I submit to you, is getting rid of small dollar donors. Those aren't corrupting, right? You have a right to give someone $15 and put some campaign signs out. That's never on the table for reform. So when people say money is a problem, if you sort of dig into it, they're talking about big dollars, but that's not really associated with what they think is the problem. There's something wrong in American politics. I don't think it's campaign finance. I think it's more, I don't know. I said I wouldn't go down that rabbit hole. It's something else. The fourth issue, or the fourth idea is, I think that the major issues in campaign finance have been decided correctly. One of them is, the First Amendment protects the freedom of speech, and he suggested maybe that money isn't speech. If we go back to Buckley versus Vallejo, really important principle, money is speech, so it's protected. I think money is speech, and just kind of play it out in your head. So we've decided, through the legal system that, what else is speech? Strip clubs or burning draft cards, that's speech, apparently, doctrinally. Well, okay, if those are speech, then spending money on political ads seems like probably that should be too. But what if you were to say, well, those cases are wrongly decided? Strip clubs and draft card burning, those really shouldn't be speech. Speech should just be talking, like we're doing now. We go into the town square, we've got something to say. The homeless guys you pass on the street, you know how effective that is. So if we were to limit it to just actual speech, you'd be unhappy because you can't talk to enough people and they wouldn't want to listen to you. So it means something more than, I think, just talking. It must, or it would be ineffective. So, if you're going to leverage the tools that are available to you, the press is textually protected, right? There's freedom of speech and the press are both textually in the First Amendment. What about television? Television is not really speech, right? It's sound waves, or I don't understand. It's probably not sound waves. It's some sort of wave. Or the internet. Sure, you can talk in a video and put it on the internet, but it's not really speech anymore. It's more electrons. So speech means something more than literally what I'm doing right now. And you can't do any of those things without money and organization and technology. And if we've already accepted societally that all these other things are speech, draft cards and strip clubs, I just think money has to be speech. Otherwise, what you will be left with, what's actually protected, is the press, because it's in the text, right? The newspaper, which no one reads anymore. You can look at readership rates on it. It's actually shocking how no one reads the newspaper. I think I subscribed, but I haven't opened it in months. Or just talking to people. That's not enough for you to understand what's going on. It has to be all these other things as well, which doesn't happen without money. So I just don't see a way around that. And the other big question is, if campaign finance is to stop corruption, okay, I think we can agree, campaign finance is not to stop speech, right? That's not a goal that I think any state would countenance. If it's to stop corruption, well then, what's corruption mean? Definitely means bribery, quid pro quo, everyone's against that, you can't do it anywhere in the country, maybe other countries. But what about things that are proximate to bribery, really good influence? Some lobbyists have notoriously close relationships with some politicians, but there's never a bribe, or certainly never a provable bribe in very few exceptions. Man, I just don't think you can regulate that. Someone will always have the ear of the next person in line. Your neighbor may become the governor. And even if you're not political, if something comes up, you can knock on your neighbor's door because you've known him or her for 20 years and say hey, there's this bill and it really affects me. I want you to think about it. You will have exerted very disproportionate influence over the governor's thinking on that bill just by the happenstance of your address. You will never stop that. and you couldn't criminalize it without having really unfair consequences. So like, my view is anything short of quid pro quo corruption just shouldn't be regulated. Like, you will always have people who are close to decision makers, and that's like immutable. It will never change. Let's see, I think I had one more point. A specific criticism. So in the text that Brian put on the screen, it had an exception, had a limiting factor. So basically, the courts shouldn't be involved as long as the states are reasonably regulating the field. About half the states would drive a truck through that language, like reasonable regulation. They'd say like, well, if you're capping spending, that's unreasonable, or this contribution limit is too low or too high. I think you'd have a lot of litigation still, and I think those cases would be decided differently in different places. None of this is to say that all is well in American politics. It's not, but I don't think this is the problem. Thanks.
So I should let Brian have a chance to respond and have some give and take, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. Well, thanks. It was great to hear your thoughts. So the thing that I wanted to respond to was the last point, actually, about there are always going to be people that have the ear of a politician, or there are always going to be people that maybe have disproportionate influence. And I'm not going to necessarily disagree with that, but I just want us to think about the form that the influence takes and who actually can have it. So let's imagine that we live in a system or in a state that has decided that they really want to reduce the role of money in selecting who their office holders are. And they just limit how much campaigns can raise and how much campaigns can spend. So then what happens if you're somebody that wants to run for election? You have to figure out ways to win votes without money as the resource. Now, you still have speech, you still have the right to assemble with other people, you still have the right to go to a town hall, you still have the right to run for lower office to get to know people and build a constituency and then run for state office. So, and there are going to be people along the way that are good friends of yours and they may have your ear. It's a different type of influence, but it should be up to the American people to say, well, we'd actually prefer that. We would actually prefer to have a state where the incentives are, in order to get elected, a lot of people at the grassroots have to know who you are. They have to see you in the grocery store. You have to show up to town halls. You don't have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on dropping mailers or big TV ads, right? So I think the American people should be able to make that decision about what type of influence they want to matter when it comes to choosing our elected officials. The other thing that I wanted to say is I completely agree. Everybody feels that there's something wrong with American politics. The reason why, I should just tell you, I started off as a volunteer for this organization 5.5 years ago. Had just started a family, but I was one of these nerds who loved law school and still wanted to stay in law. So I started volunteering, and I just fell in love with the mission and the people that we were meeting across the country and the issue, because it was like the one thing in 2016, 2017, 2018 that I found was genuinely unifying people. Like most people probably have no idea what my personal politics are, but I can say that I meet people on the far right, the far left, and we actually have common ground on this idea of popular sovereignty, this idea that the people should actually matter and their voices should matter, and that the vast majority of folks, they don't have money to spend. They actually don't have money. The $200 donation to a campaign is a stretch for the vast majority of the American people. So I do find that of all the things that you talk to people about, this is a unifying thing, and I think we can actually get it done. I will just say a little bit about, while I can, a little bit about the actual strategy. So last night, who was here for Senator Feingold's talk, right? He talked a lot about Article 5, it was awesome. but also daunting because we haven't really amended the Constitution since the late 60s and early 70s, setting aside the 27th, which was weird. But in order to do it, right, the way we're trying to do it, which is proposal by Congress and then ratification by 3/4 of the states, you cannot do that with just one party. It's just impossible. So your strategy has to be all-embracing, all-encompassing, welcoming everyone, strange bedfellows, all of that. So that is how we operate. We have people on our board and advisory council that are conservative Republicans, originalists. We have more progressive Democrats. We have former members of the military. We have, progressive social workers. And we are working in states because what we want to be able to do is, although Congress would be the one to propose, the way to get Congress on board is to demonstrate the massive support in their home base and their constituency. So that's what we're doing. That's sort of the strategy. And I hope you all consider getting involved. All right, thanks.
Hi, question for Brian. So I hear you talking about the polling on this issue, and I hear you talking about popular sovereignty, an idea which has a less than noble history in this country. And what I kind of hear is, isn't the whole point of the First Amendment to protect expression that people don't like? So I hear, oh, well, a lot of people don't like the way money is spent in politics, so we need an amendment to stop that. But isn't the whole point of the First Amendment and the Constitution to say some things are so fundamental to citizenship in this country that we're not going to let the people vote them away? And so when I hear about your amendment, I hear about voting away a fundamental right, and particularly a right of political expression, which has always been understood to be core to the First Amendment. So how do you look at that in considering your amendment?
Sure. So I appreciate the question. I would say that if the text of the First Amendment said anything about money and campaigns and elections, I might agree with you that it is a fundamental right under the Bill of Rights, but that's not what the First Amendment talks about. It talks about the freedom of speech. And there's nothing in our proposal that would propose to regulate the content of speech, the viewpoints expressed, anything like that. So it's not limiting people's freedom of speech, their ability to express themselves however they see fit. It's simply empowering the states and Congress to regulate money, similar to the way, I forget the name of the Supreme Court case, but it was about like a hand truck and how loud you could be spreading messages at certain hours, right? It was like a time, place, and manner restriction. You can limit money because money amplifies a message, but it doesn't change the message, and it doesn't require that the message be one thing versus the other, which is what the freedom of speech at its core is about. That's my view. I don't know if Corey wants to offer a different view.
So the last thing you said is what is kind of giving me pause. So I guess your point is that if someone spends, let's say, $100,000 on their message, that's enough speech. Like, they shouldn't be allowed to spend $1 million because their idea is out there and they don't have the right to kind of drown out the others. But they shouldn't have the right. This is more theoretical.
Yeah, it's not that that person would no longer be able to express themselves on the issue. They have other ways of doing that. It's just you wouldn't be able to spend money now again, I'm actually agnostic about the actual regulation. So there could be a state, and let's just say there's a state like Virginia that says, you know what, we actually don't want any limits on money. We just want very quick disclosure to know who's spending money and how. Okay, fine, give that a shot. Like I don't really have strong feelings about the content of any specific policy. I think Virginia should be able to experiment with that. Another state might be able to say, oh, you know what? We have concerns that if we ask for too much disclosure, it may disincentivize people from contributing. So we're not so concerned about disclosure, but we're going to set lower limits so that we know people don't have disproportionate influence. They could try that out. Like I'm fine with people experimenting in different ways. But the basic point is that money itself is not speech. It's not a form of expression. It's a tool that's used to amplify people's ideas. And honestly, in a campaign, money pays for a lot of other things besides just speech at this point. So I think we should remember that too. It's not like all of this money is just about amplifying a message. It's about paying for all of the other things that go into the campaign and make the campaign bigger sometimes than the American people might think it needs to be.
One of the interesting things that, like concepts that you've mentioned a couple of times, or referenced at least, is so in my mind, the two big concepts are money is speech, and you can't stop anything except quid pro quo corruption. And one of the ideas that I feel like you're kind of getting at is this like rough parity in speech between, like, you know, poor guy working an hourly job and the billionaire. And so that is a big concept, right? And there may be something to that, particularly since in American politics now there's this idea of saturation. Like, there is a point in a campaign, you see it here because we're a purple state, where like spending another $10 doesn't matter because everyone's like, enough, like I've stopped listening, right? That's not happened until recently. And so I mean, perhaps part of what you're getting at is this idea, like, we need to rethink we need to add a big principle, which is, in an age of, like, a post-saturation age, there should be some principle of parity, like expenditure limits should be added, whereas before they weren't.
So I love that you brought that up, because it allows me to make a really nerdy digression into this concept of freedom of attention, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, but I actually think it's at the forefront of the main challenge for humanity now. There is so much saturation in terms of information and wanting our eyeballs on this versus that our most precious commodity as humans right now is our freedom of attention. What are the things we choose to attend to? And right now, money is the way that people can purchase essentially the bandwidth, the public bandwidth. And so that is determining what is going to be available for us to attend to. And I guess what I'm suggesting is, maybe it's a quasi-anti-monopolist suggestion, but if the idea of the First Amendment is to allow for a free exchange of ideas, with the idea being that truth will emerge, that gets a lot harder if actually the only ideas people are getting exposed to are the few ideas whose people have the greatest purchasing power to get them in front of us. So that's part of what's motivating this too.
Hi, thank you both for coming. I have one question. I guess it's in response to Brian's survey, but it is for both speakers. I think that we can agree that there is a problem in politics, and money is related to that. But it seems to me that in a very politicized climate, I think everyone's willing to point the finger at the other side and say that maybe politics is being affected by money, but a lot of people would say it's in a very localized area. For instance, you brought up a point about Maine. There are a lot of people in Maine who are specifically worried about how it's affecting Maine, but is that really just affecting certain areas? It's very localized, or is this equally being affected in places that might be more rural, like Idaho or Mississippi?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's, if you're interested in this topic, there's a professor named David Fontana who's written what he calls the geography of campaign finance. And he basically makes the point that if you look at the data, there are certain donor zip codes in the US that are concentrated in like a few recognizable metropolitan areas. And then there are the recipient zip codes, which quite honestly change from cycle to cycle based on the power broker's calculation of which race they want to flip. And sometimes it's a local district attorney race in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes it's a higher profile Senate race in Maine. But the money gets targeted where they feel it'll be the most impactful, and it is reaching small rural communities. Alaska is another good example of, they have had such a history of outside money pouring into their state that they've tried multiple times to take things into their hands to essentially allow for differential limits based on whether you're an Alaskan or an outsider. I think they should be able to try that out as a matter of Alaskan popular sovereignty. So anyway, I would check out David Fontana's work. It's really good. Thanks for the question.
Thank you both so much for being here. I have a question for Corey. I had a couple of problems with some of the comparisons that you made to try to argue that maybe this isn't as big of a priority as we make it, but I wanted to ask, I think specifically I'm not sure that because I spend more money on my coffee that means that I don't have any interest in how much money goes into politics, or that it's not something that I care about. But I wanted to ask more about what you said about corruption, and basically the idea that quid pro quo corruption is the only thing that regulations might be able to try to root out. And you made this argument that maybe because I might grow up next to the future governor, that gives me some sort of access next to them. But I think what we're all more worried about here is the idea that some billionaire might buy the house next door to every single person that's running for a governor in every single state and then have access to that person. Is that not something that you would view as an issue, or is that just the luck of the draw and there's always going to be influence that someone has?
First on your coffee. You either value your coffee, how much did you give to campaigns last cycle?
Probably somewhere between like $40 and $100.
You probably spent more than that on coffee.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that I did, and that I don't think that doesn't give me an interest in regulating campaigns.
No, I wouldn't say it gives you no. I wouldn't say it gives you no interest, but if you're rational, and you have impulse control, then you spend your money on what you value. I mean, that's just economics, right? So I think you're
right. So isn't that why like a certain very small number of people spend all of their money on elections, because they think that has some value that's coming back to them, and I might not have as much to spend in that same area.
So this is an interesting question, why people give. I think they give.
I think that like the give distinction that you're making, like there certainly are people that solicit donations well at a small dollar rate, and there are people that have been successful that way, but I think things like independent expenditure that we're talking about don't really have anything to do with individual giving to campaigns, which is already capped for individual people.
That's right. So there's a lot going on there, and I don't know that I'm going to remember all of your points to respond to them. I don't think you could point to any examples of billionaires buying houses next to candidates to shore up influence. Like, I just don't think it's ever happened. Or even something similar. Like, I think what you have is like billionaires befriending people who think like them, and whether they did that before or after an election, they would be interested in talking to each other. And like, unless there's money changing hands for policy, like, that's like life. Like, you want people to talk to each other and learn from, socialize, and like, I just don't see anything short of a trade. Like, here's money, vote, like, sign that bill for me. I don't know how you draw the line. Like, are we going to prohibit billionaires from having neighbors? We can't do that, right? Like, what if you want to meet the next governor? Like, it's impossible to define soft corruption, so it has to be hard only. I know you had a lot of other points, but I've missed them.
Yeah. No, I think that's honestly a fine place to leave it. It seems like your kind of overarching point is that like, unless you could do it definitively and perfectly, that it's not worth doing. So.
That's a straw
point
man.
of disagreement.
That's a straw man. I mean, I'd be happy to take an imperfect approach to that. So let me put it to you. What sort of soft influence would you prohibit?
I mean, I could think of like very recent Supreme Court cases that have ruled that it wasn't corruption, for example, for members of campaign staff to leave, go do private favors for people, and then immediately come back to working for that elected official. And the Supreme Court has said that doesn't come to the level of a quid pro quo corruption, and so that's not something that can be regulated or considered.
I'm not sure that's a campaign finance issue.
I think you're right that was a criminal issue, but I guess what I'm saying is I think that there's a lot of pretty easy things we could all agree are.
What about this? Let me give you like the most influential soft influence example that you can imagine. It's spouses. Like, you will see the governor every night and every morning, and in the most intimate ways, if you're married to him or her, they have a ton of influence, right? And they may even have separate finances. In Arizona, we're a community property state, but like, there are certainly married couples where they're like, the one spouse is like a trust fund and there's a prenup, and so like a ton of money on one side. Extreme influence, but no one's saying that your spouse is buying your influence. Extreme influence, you can't ban it. What if they're not married?
You can't ban it, but you could at the very least require that all of that gets disclosed, right? Like, I think that's one of the issues we're looking at right now with Ginny Thomas, for example, who takes payments from a lot of people, and we don't know where that money comes from. And you're right, she does talk to Clarence Thomas every day about politics.
Okay.
Sorry, not my event.
Keep going.
Very quick response. I think of disclosure as primarily voyeurism. Like, it's interesting and it doesn't change anyone's mind, as long as you're not, if you're disclosing transactions that definitionally weren't quid pro quo. It's $5,000 definitionally. Like, we've all decided as a country, $5,000 to a congressman won't influence them. That's what you're disclosing. It's voyeurism. It's not actual, like, the substantive concern is someone's buying influence, and it's not that.
Hi, thanks guys for coming. I have a question more for Brian. This is a little bit more technical because I'm super big into campaign finance, and I've actually seen quite a few proposed amendments. I noticed yours didn't include a provision about making sure it's not construed to limit the freedom of the press. Because, you know, like, at the end of the day, like, most political speech involves some kind of money. Like, if you're putting out flyers, that's money. You know, an ad, like, on TV or, you know, even a rally, you're spending some kind of money. So if somebody, like, does a piece in the newspaper about why you shouldn't vote for this person, are you just kind of relying on the court to go, well, we already have, like, freedom of the press, like, in the Bill of Rights, so, you know, this new amendment didn't do anything to it? Is that what you're relying on, or?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and I'll just make one point about the language of the amendment that you saw today, which is, although we sort of consider it like our preferred language at the moment, it's also, as it gets closer to a formal proposal by Congress, we know that things are going to change and people are going to make good points about what should be included or what should be tweaked. And so for now, we have taken the position of the press clause stands on its own 2 feet. The language in Section 2 where it says nothing in the Constitution, we wanted to be careful about not just limiting it to the First Amendment. It's saying nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to forbid Congress and the states from regulating. But it doesn't mean that the rest of the constitutional provisions no longer are part of the mix in the interest balancing. And to actually a point that Corey had made earlier, our use of the word reasonably, again, this is a little bit technical, but it is meant to get the judiciary into more of an interest balancing assessment, but significantly deferential approach. Almost, I don't want to make a perfect, you know, I don't want to prognosticate too much, but almost the way that there has been deference to like a state Supreme Court construing its own constitution, that sort of a thing. But anyway, I hope that answered your question. Like, maybe the press proviso does end up in the ultimate version, but for now, we think it doesn't change the analysis.
Thank you.
Quickly, got it, can do. Little prelude before my question. I think it's fair to say that speech as itself, we like to think of as a non-finite resource. To use your example, if I were to want to go to a strip club, there's a very low financial threshold to do that. If I want to wear an armband, I can wear that as many times as I want. I can speak like I am now. That's my right to speak as a non-finite resource. But I think it's also fair to say that money is a finite resource. And when we think about candy or soda or coffee, whether you think these are necessarily things that are worthwhile for sustainment, if I were on a work trip, I could file those as food expenses for my sustainment. Do you guys think it's fair to say that speech as a financial resource, speech as money, is a finite resource?
I'm gonna have to think about that. So I'm gonna try to respond to this with a little bit of an analogy, right? So I grew up in Massachusetts where we still have like town meeting where everybody in the town comes together once a year to decide certain questions. And there's a moderator there because they know that there's X number of people who may have an interest in speaking on Y number of issues. If instead of having a moderator whose job it is to try to make sure that everybody gets some airtime and that the discussion of issues is, you know, balanced and full, instead you had a system where walking in the door, they were like, hey, every 5 minutes is $100. Shell it out, right? I think that we know what would happen there, which is that in the first version of the system, everybody's on an equal footing regardless of the size of their bank account because everybody has, they have the breath and the time and, you know, the body, everybody's equal footing. But if we have a system where actually your bank account determines how much airtime you get, the resource that people have in terms of money can be greatly disparate. And so those people will start to get disproportionate influence over the conversation. Whereas if we were just left to our normal resources of speech and conversation, it would be more equal. I don't know if that totally answered your question.
Absolutely. I agree with that. If someone can afford a megaphone, then they'll probably drown out the rest of the speech. Thank you. Corey?
What happens if we gave everyone unlimited access to the airwaves? Well, then there's not enough, right? So there's limited resources here. What happened if we gave everyone equal access to the airwaves? Well, you'd see like a bunch of 5-second ads and it would be totally incoherent. Okay, so what else could you do? Well, you could have a free market, right? Like, how important is it to you this message gets out? Okay, here's the price. The price is above or below how important it is to you and you pay it. That's the system we have. That's not a bad way of balancing it. The concern, I think, is that sometimes the public interest will not be, it will be inconsistent with the interests of the wealthiest people, or the largest corporations or whatever. What happens then? Well, actually, there's very weak evidence that the people can't figure that out. Like, as long as you have some funding for the public's view on this, and now you don't need much funding, right? Like websites, Twitter, like it's incredible how fast news can spread now relative to 100 years ago. I mean, absolutely incredible. People figure it out. You can see underfunded candidates winning all the time. It happens like, I don't know, 20% of the races perhaps, and in the other races, it's the upper dog effect, like people like giving money to the upper dog, right? So it's not like there's a chicken and egg problem there. I think there's enough money so everyone gets their idea out.
Well, clearly this is a conversation that's going to go on and on. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to our speakers. Please, we have some pocket constitutions. Constitution Day is coming up next week, and we have information about our remaining events at the Center for Constitutional Design this semester. So please join us and join